facilitating resilience. Years ago, probably a decade now, we had a group come together, and it was a group focused on resiliency and what is resiliency and how do we increase people's resiliency. And this is a definition that they developed over the course of their time working together, that resiliency is an inner capacity that, when nurtured, facilitated, and supported by others, empowers children, youth, and families to successfully meet life's challenges with a sense of self-determination, mastery, hope, and well-being. So just a reminder, resiliency isn't just about bouncing back, it's about moving forward and feeling good about it. Typically, resiliency is nurtured by family, faith, and friends in young children. Resiliency is a characteristic inherent in all people, and when we suffer from a lot of trauma or traumatic stress, resiliency can take a hit, and it needs extra support to become effective. And so many of us in the child, youth, and family serving organizations and systems can assist that by facilitating the growth of resiliency through our services, our supports, and by making sure that the youth has accommodations to sort of level the playing field a little bit, if you would. And finally, resiliency needs to be supported out in our communities. This can be through education or additional opportunities, but resiliency is an innate characteristic, and we want to help it along. So let's look at what we're talking about there. The resiliency itself is a protective factor, but it breaks down into a lot of different areas. The primary area, the number one area that is a marker for success in life, is to have positive connections and supportive relationships. You need secure attachment. You have to have some sort of interaction and pro-social interaction with your peers. And you need other social connections and activities to sort of grow that part of resiliency. Today we're going to focus a little bit more on competencies. And competencies meaning you know what you're doing and you're good at doing it. And to do that, you need to develop skills, your own abilities, and of course, people have their own strengths and talents, and we always want to remember to tap into that. One of the first skills that is recognized as being needed in populations that suffer from traumatic stress and trauma is problem-solving skills. Whether we recognize it or not, we spend a huge portion of our time solving problems. We make decisions all day long about what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And sometimes if we lack those problem-solving skills, we have difficulty even with daily decisions and tasks. Another thing that's often focused on is regulation. Being able to emotionally regulate ourselves so that we can perform our skills and have those relationships. Another area in the resiliency literature has to do with contribution and service, the opportunity to give back to others. This is occasionally overlooked when we look at our high-risk, high-need kids, because we're so busy trying to help take care of them and figure out what they need that we can overlook the idea that their ability and opportunity to give back and to help others is really a key component to feeling good about yourself. Hope and optimism is also wrapped up in resiliency protective factors, and having a positive view of yourself and of the future. We call this a futures orientation, and it is classically problematic for children, especially in the child welfare system. They don't see themselves out into the future, and that works against them in the long run. And finally, having appropriate expectations that will maximize their potential. This means not just identifying them as a victim or as somebody who needs help, but as a person who can improve and who can meet reasonable, realistic, and achievable expectations. This came out of that resiliency group as well. These are the building blocks of a resiliency. Because, of course, as with most things, there's a sequence or you need to have the things at the bottom before you can build up to the things at the top. And so at the bottom, we have basic needs and resources. And honestly, this is a lot of, this has impacted us in nearly every system of care case that we sit around this echo and work on, because some basic needs and resources are missing or are challenging. And those have to be met before people can move on and work on positive connections and mastery of skills. And up there at the top, the well-being, quality of life stuff, we don't often get all the way to this one, because if we were working way up there, they probably wouldn't need our intensive problem solving and assistance. But it's definitely where we're aiming for, is for people to have that sense of well-being and to really experience a full quality of life. So when I think about sequencing, I go back to Bruce Perry, and he has developed what he calls neurological sequencing. But for me, it just says order matters. The order in which we do things and intervene with children, youth, and families is important. And sometimes if we feel stuck or we're not going someplace, we should go back and look at what is that order. Bruce would tell us, Dr. Bruce Perry would tell us this, one of the things that has to happen very early on is helping people regulate. If we can't help them feel okay in their own skin and in the areas where they are, it's very difficult then to move on with any other interventions and things. And so we need to help them feel like they can regulate. One of the fastest ways to regulate somebody emotionally is to help them regulate physically. So rather than trying to dig in and get to the bottom of whatever the emotional issue or threat is, just getting them to do some physical activity can help move us into that regulated state. His second part of his sequence is relationships. And so if you can get somebody to feel a little bit regulated, then we can start to make that oh so important relational connection. And his third step in his sequence is that having the person be regulated and developing a relationship with them is the only way that you can get into their cortex and start to reason with them. And many of our interventions tend to be verbal or very thought-provoking, and you really can't use those until the person feels regulated and has a relationship with you. So I like to flip this over into a sequence of engagement. And underneath all of that, they have to feel safe. So you must help them feel and be safe in the environment in which they're in. And then we can work on regulation, which moves or couples with having a relationship and finally getting up into their cortex of reasoning and thinking and making decisions and problem solving and all those things. So very briefly, I want to give you the core elements of how to regulate, what helps in regulating activities. It does need to be relational. You can't just say, go off somewhere and regulate yourself, okay? It's always best if we're doing these things with them. Regulating activities are particularly regulating when they're rhythmic. This goes back to the womb and hearing that heartbeat and having all your needs met without you having to do anything. So making things rhythmic. Walking, by the way, is one of the simplest rhythmic activities you can do. Adults' go-to activity for regulating is to talk with other people, with other adults generally, and speaking and having conversation has its own rhythm. Doing these things repetitively helps you feel like you can regulate yourself. And then here are some other R words, because Bruce Perry likes the alliteration of all the R's. And so the activities should feel rewarding. You should feel better after you do these activities. They should be relevant to you. If you're a child, they're going to be playful. If you're an adult, they might be more insightful kinds of activities. And finally, as always in trauma-informed care, we must be respectful of meeting the people where they're at and helping them to find the best way to feeling regulated. I'm stuck. Okay, whoop, there. Thanks, Jamie. Jamie and I are getting it together here. So that was Bruce's first step, was regulation. The next thing he talks about is relationship or relational strategies. This is a not complete list of all sorts of relational strategies that you can use to increase your relationship with the person or with the family that you're working with. Of course, the first one is always going to be to try to make things feel as safe as possible. But then consistency, appropriate communication, the adults and others modeling appropriate relationships, being responsive to the youth when they need something, using proximity. Sometimes being closer to somebody helps them feel calmer and safer, and sometimes that feels threatening and we need to step back. So proximity does not just mean get proximal, it means pay attention to the cues from the person you're working with as to what proximity is best for them. Validate them wherever they are. I find it interesting that the most common thing that adults say to kids who look dysregulated is, stop that, sit down and be quiet. And that is invalidating, completely invalidating, and we need to stop saying that and instead say, I see you. I see that you're agitated. I see that you might feel unhappy. I see that you're struggling, because that is way more connecting and relational than saying, stop doing that and then I'll help you. Offer support. What kind of support would you like from your best friend if you were feeling all out of sorts and dysregulated? Need a drink of water, take a little walk, a pat on the back, those sorts of things. Co-regulation. For quite some time now, we've been talking about self-regulation in our respective different fields, but the truth is we all co-regulate. Very seldom do we have to regulate all alone by ourselves, and I think we need to rethink this whole concept of regulation and make sure that we're making it relational, because most people regulate with other people. Attunement is a way to mirror or reflect to the person that you understand what they're thinking and feeling. That's assuming their body posture and their tone and their facial expressions. And direct coaching. If they are connected with you and they feel like you are helpful to them, giving them instructions and coaching can be effective, but you must have that relationship already. And finally, you can never overuse praise. Praise that they're getting through it, praise that they're trying, praise that they have succeeded in different tasks or some of the strategies that you've already tried. This is a slide direct from Dr. Rick Shepler, and this is how we look at translating resiliency into practice and all the different levels. You might notice that it reflects those building blocks of resiliency that I showed you earlier. You have to do that safety and validation and reducing risk down at the bottom before you can move up in this model to building competencies and skills, establishing positive relationships, and then we can move into that asset building and futures orientation. Strength-based case planning. How can you use case planning and planning your interventions to intentionally increase resiliency? Well, one of the ways you can do that is focus on these different areas of resiliency. So I break it into 4 different areas. Safety and control, making them feel like they have some agency, so they get to make some of their own decisions, they have voice and choice. Connection, lots of social connections. Some of the kids that we hear with presentations, and we'll hear that again today, have a lack of appropriate or pro-social connections, and that's one way that should be built right into treatment plans and interventions. How do we get them as connected as possible? And not just with workers, because of course, when the work ends, we're gone, and we need those connections to remain. Skills and competencies, building all the skills and helping them master those skills, which does not mean giving them a worksheet, and it does not mean giving them instructions one time. It means rehearsal, rehearsal, rehearsal. And then finally, let's not forget that opportunity to give back. Service and contribution has a significant impact on how they feel about themselves and helps them realize their place in the world, their place in their family, their place in their community, and what they have to offer. These are those resiliency components broken into those 4 areas, and they're intertwined. It's very difficult sometimes to separate them, but if you can keep the whole picture in mind, we understand that they need to feel safe, have agency, and give them a choice about what's going on. Making those connections both with peers, and sometimes to do that, you've got to work on those social skills, which actually would drop down into that competency quadrant, but it's difficult. This is where there's a lot of crossover. When you have relations, when you have connections, they're able to buffer things for you. If you lose your temper and you have a friend who will throw his arm around your shoulder and calm you down a little bit, then you might not get in so much trouble. Those sorts of things. And we get buffered all the time when we don't even think about it, but these kids with the lack of social connections don't have that same kind of buffering that, for instance, our own children might have. Competencies and skills, we already talked a little bit about this, co-regulation and problem solving right up there at the top, but you should also be digging for not what do they need, like what skills are they missing, but what abilities and talents do they already have? Because it's easier to build upon something that already exists than to try to create something where there's a dearth. So contribution is the last one, and they need to have, even kids with pretty significant disabilities and diagnoses, need to know what their responsibilities are and how they can work towards fulfilling them, having chores and opportunities to contribute back to the family or the situation in which they live, and finally opportunities to contribute to the greater good. And how can we help them do that? Now I'm going to jump right into a few particular skills that are helpful across the board with our kids in multiple systems. Number 1, mindfulness. In order for them to be able to reflect and to manage their own emotions, they need mindfulness skills. Thank you to Marsha Linehan for bringing us this in a clinical and meaningful way through DBT, but now everyone has access to the understanding of mindfulness. I gave you a few bullet points here on things that you can use as interventions and or things that you can teach the kids to do. And let's not just teach the youth, the entire family should be able to utilize these very basic skills to be more mindful, including take a break, take a safety break, take a break to calm yourself down, remove yourself from the situation. This does not mean run away or abandon the situation. This means take a few minutes and agree to come back together and then deal with whatever it is you have to deal with when you're calmer and safer yourself. Take a breath and be safe. Identify the emotion. That name it to tame it phrase that I have at the top is a phrase from Dan Siegel, who is sort of a mindfulness guru and has a lot of books and information out there. But he says, learn to identify the emotions and name it. And only when we're able to identify it and name it can we can then think about rationally, what do we want to do about that emotion? Or do we have to do anything? Can we just breathe and feel that we're angry or that we're sad and understand that emotions will pass, but the catch is we don't want our emotions to control our behaviors. You can self-regulate by taking a drink of water, stretching, walking, and going out into green space. Those are all calming, regulating things that you can do. And then when you're in a good space and you are able to be mindful, can you identify what made you triggered, what made you flip out, if you would? The whole point here is to create space between your emotions and your reactions. Naming an emotion can help calm it. Reflection will help you integrate your emotions and your behaviors. Another skill that is critical is problem solving. And so instead of just talking about the fact that they need problem solving, I'm going to give you a problem solving model so that if you don't have a problem solving model of your own that you favor, this is the simplest one and can be used with very young children up through families. A, B, C, D, E. I think everyone can remember that since it's the first 5 letters of our alphabet. Here's the model. First, ask, what's the problem? If I'm working on the problem and I have one perspective on it, but my youth thinks the problem is different. For instance, if I think the problem is you didn't come home on time for your curfew, and the youth thinks the problem is I'm an overbearing parent, we're working on different problems. So the first thing when you want to legitimately problem solve with other people, you all have to come up with a common definition of what's the problem. What are we trying to solve here? Once you have identified and been able to articulate the problem, have a little brainstorming session. What are all the possible things that we could do about this problem? It doesn't mean you're going to do all the things, and most people are aware of brainstorming rules, which include no idea is a bad idea. All ideas can be brought to the table. It doesn't mean you're going to choose that idea, but all the ideas are valid. And you know, some of the craziest ideas in the world have turned into really amazing inventions, plans, and things. Third step, choose one of them. Together, whoever's involved in the problem solving, and in my mind it's always a family, choose which of the ideas do you think you would like or be able to try now. And narrow it down. Do not get overwhelmed with the 20, 30, 100 different brainstorming ideas, but pick what you think can be implemented most simply and most easily to affect some sort of change. Then, of course, you have to do it. Put it into action, do it, try it, check it out. Once you do it, you circle back around and evaluate it. Did it solve the problem? Did it improve the situation? Did it give you other ideas that you might have? If it was a good solution, then move on. If it wasn't and that solution didn't work, go back to that brainstorming list and see if you can find something else that might help you down that path. So, in some longitudinal studies around resilience by Maston and Telgin, here's some of the things that I thought were relevant to our conversation about this. Competence in developmental tasks, or being able to get them to meet their developmental milestones at any age, forecasts growth in future development. Okay, so if you're able to master developmental tasks as you're growing up, that is a sign that you'll be able to master tasks further on down the road. Resilience tends to endure. If you can master those tasks, if you can be resilient in one stage or in one situation, that tends to endure and you have a better chance of being resilient in the future. Competence begets competence. If you can learn skills, you can learn more skills. And there's very little that can't be broken down and taught in a stepwise situation as a skill. And this will be important for the case we're talking about today. Emerging adulthood may be an important window of opportunity for changing direction. There are 2 very large times that kids' neurobiology changes. Of course, we're probably all very familiar about the birth to 5 situation where you have the most massive brain growth and development. But adolescence is the second time, and we think of it as a time when your brain gets remodeled. And that is a huge opportunity to add new skills, to help them think in different ways. They get just thinking and can understand different levels of conversation and infer things. And so late resilience is not only possible, late resilience is a definite, adolescence is a definite time to try to apply some of these concepts so that they can become more self-regulated, better at problem solving, better to read and understand other people. All of those things can happen in adolescence, even if it's been a struggle up until then. And there's a little quote for you by Frederick Douglass that it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. So we want to support people from a resiliency-oriented perspective. We need to honor their personal experience, appreciate their perspective, understand that everybody's doing the best they can given their current abilities, and I like to say, given their current brain and their life circumstances. Validate them for their expertise, their courage, their efforts, their persistence. We want to validate them because the truth is we all need expertise, courage, effort, and persistence to get through life. And it's a never-ending struggle. Valuing, understand and respect the unique beliefs and all the things that come with that for a person and for a family. Be respectfully humble. Be curious about their culture, including their individual culture and their family culture. And finally, provide hope. Foster the possibility of hope and positive outcomes. That takes us to the end of our didactic